G'day everybody, it's Dave from Wing Chun Mind Force. Today I'm extremely fortunate to be talking to my friend Kevin Earle from New Zealand. That's I won't make the joke about it being part of Australia. I think I'd prefer if Australia was part of New Zealand, to tell the truth. But yeah, Kevin's a long time practitioner of Wing Chun and came to my attention when I'd heard his name, but I don't know exactly where. I just heard his name as sort of one of those names to conjure with. And then I saw some of his videos and really sat up and went, wow, this man knows what he's talking about. And we don't know each other terribly well. It's good that we're finally getting to know each other a bit, but we have Beau Bouzaid in common. And I think you know my mate, Ivan Howe.
Yes, I met Ivan. Yes,
another great gentleman. He's a lovely fella, and he taught me a huge amount of my Wing Chun. And so yeah, welcome, Kev. I just wanted to start off asking you a bit about your background, and as I said, I know a little bit about it, but I'm really keen to hear, like, when you started out in martial arts, when you started out in Wing Chun, how you learnt, and how you've continued.
Right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Dave, and I'll try and get used to looking at the camera so that I'm really looking at you rather than looking at your picture.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry too much. Even the professionals, they're often looking completely different directions.
Yes. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit about myself, but more importantly about one or two other people and some of the people I've met over the years, and perhaps even finish off with a training tip or two that I've learned over the years.
Really love that. Yep.
It's a big ask, David, to follow someone like Nima King and Carl Drinkwater and Ivan and Beau Bouzaid and Beau Bouzaid, as I say.
Yeah.
But I mean, Carl Drinkwater's story is really inspirational, and is a real warrior that I'm looking forward to meeting at some stage. Although we live in the same country, he lives in the North Island, which is a wee island just to the east, I think, of that wee island called Australia that's up there somewhere.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And so I'm looking forward to meeting him and sharing a coffee and a story with him at some stage. And Beau, of course, I've had a very long association with on a personal friend level, as well as a student-teacher relationship. Although I'm Beau's first teacher, but really, in essence, we were really training partners, training mates, and I think I've learned more from Beau than he ever learned from me, really.
Yeah.
So it's been a mutual relationship. You know, he's a really dedicated and loyal Wing Chun practitioner. You know, and you've met him, of course, now, and he's only a wee guy, but boy, is he very strong.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned a wee story. I remember not long after we started training together, Beau said to me, what do you do if someone grabs your wrists or your arms? I said, oh, grab my arms and I'll show you. Well, he grabbed my arms and I couldn't move. I had to show him something else, of course. So one of those wake up moments, you know.
Yeah.
Where, but yeah, the little things that make training enjoyable, and you know, we just made good friends after that, you know. As to my own background, a little bit about that. I've often said, and I've written it on my website, that I was the first person that I know that had to publicly teach a Chinese martial art in New Zealand. Certainly Wing Chun.
What
And
year?
it's true, but it's not quite true. And I'd like to go over a little bit of that history so that people understand where I'm coming from with that, David. You probably find the same sort of history in Australia. The Chinese were coming into New Zealand back in the 1840s. The first Chinese immigrants here were arrived about 1939, early 1940, well before the influx of the miners. Of course, when gold was found in Otago, the gold fields in Australia were in Victoria were sort of starting to wind down a little bit, and a lot of the Chinese that had gone to Australia to work in the gold fields there came across to New Zealand.
Oh.
And the interesting thing about that is that the majority of them actually came from the province of Canton, which of course is where Yip Man came from. It was the hotbed of Chinese martial arts in that era.
Mm.
And
Just
a lot of them were leaving to get richer, of course.
just
so,
a, you said,
sorry?
Did you say 1830 or 1930?
No, 1830. I might have misspoken and said 1930. I'm a bit like that.
I think you said 19, but I was thinking you didn't mean that. I think you were talking about the old days.
Yeah. 1839, the Chan family arrived, and then just after that, another young chap arrived and settled in Nelson, actually, and became a prominent businessman in Nelson. And then that was followed, as I say, about 15, 20 years later, you started getting the miners arriving. And it would be a bit naive to think that people who've come from the Pearl River Delta and places like that didn't actually have a clue about martial arts.
Yeah, right.
But of course, they didn't come here to fight. They came here to make some money and go back home, buy land, and raise a family. And for some of them, it didn't quite work out that way. So yeah, there's been Chinese settlements in New Zealand ever, for the last 150 years, right back from when Wing Chun was really like the other Chinese martial arts were really at their peak, probably.
How interesting.
But of course, in those days, they were getting beat up by the Japanese a bit. They were at war with Japan, who had invaded China. So a lot of them wanted to leave anyway, I guess,
Yeah, right.
But so the history is quite interesting.
Is there any sort of studies about, actual martial artists? Like, is there anything known? As you said, this probably was people, but is there anything written about Kung Fu?
They would have formed their own associations. So and of course, have a social club or something. We have a social club. We go and play darts or whatever, or snooker, and so I'm sure they did the same sort of things, except there wasn't any darts clubs or snooker clubs in those days, probably. So
we're playing mahjong.
Yeah, play mahjong and maybe beat a drum and do a bit of dancing and maybe practice some martial arts amongst themselves.
Great image.
Now, the earliest records that I've come across was in the 1950s. So yeah, coming up 100 years from when we first started this conversation. In the 1950s, there were Chinese martial arts in the way of some Kung Fu, Tai Chi, and they were practiced in the Chinese communities. There was a gentleman by the name of Peter Young, who was a Chinese gentleman who was Nelson, I believe, and I had family in Wellington and that, and his nephew or brother, or I'm not quite sure of the lineage factors, was a guy by the name of Bill Young, and they opened, Bill opened the, I believe it was Bill who started the first Chinese Martial Arts Association in New Zealand, which was formed in Wellington in 1958.
Wow.
And so, you know, that was well before that. I mean, they'd been practicing obviously together as a community for a long time before that. So that was well before the sort of kung fu craze years and that sort of thing. And those clubs were in the Hutt Valley, which was in which is up just north of Wellington. It's part of Wellington, really, and across Cook Strait at Nelson. So that was sort of the start. And I think they had a family in Wellington that taught Foot Ga, Chinese kung fu. So yeah, there's a big history. There were others. I think there was a Mantis school in Wellington as well, possibly a little bit later. But yeah, there was certainly martial arts around. So I wasn't the first to teach. I was just probably the first to teach publicly to everybody.
Yeah.
You know, I'll give that opportunity. You know.
So
yeah,
what
so
year did you start?
It's very deep history.
That's a better history than I've heard of anybody in Australia. We do have that sort of history here, but you'd have to get in with the old people in the areas where there's a lot of, you know, long-term Chinese people, which have been in Australia since that time too, and find those who have a memory of it or an interest to sort of talk to their elders to find out what was going on.
Yes, I was a wee bit fortunate in the 70s. I met a Chinese gentleman in Wellington who was, I think, practicing Foot Ga. I can't really recall. I mean, I only had the opportunity to meet him a couple of times. But if one of my students, Awatia, he's studied quite a lot of the history, and he actually trained in Foot Ga in Wellington. So he knows a lot more about it than me. You know, and Awatia is a bit of a historian, and he's also a practitioner of Maori martial arts.
Oh, right.
And there's a school, and he's had a lot of illness, but he has been currently training with Mr. Mo up in, you know, Mo, of course.
Frederick.
Frederick Mo, yes. Yeah.
I highly recommend him.
Oh, he's a very nice gentleman. He was, of course, one of Choy's early students, and
I think he's the most senior Chu Shong Tin student now. I as far as I know. I
believe so.
Yeah, he's never stopped training. He told me he started training in 1955 in Hong Kong, and you see any of those early photos from the 70s, he's always there, and I've seen probably earlier photos, but yeah, I've had the chance to train with him twice, and on Facebook he's always saying good morning to us. He's a very nice man.
Very nice gentleman. He an interesting conversation I had with him. He said that at the time he was training his form, Silan Tao. He was training for 6 hours a day.
Really?
He was training for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours during the midday, and then 2 hours again in the evening.
Wow.
And and of course he's retired, so as a retired gentleman, he has that sort of time, I guess. I think a bit more of his time might be taken up now with his grandson or his grandchildren and that. But I haven't seen him for quite some time now. But that was rather an interesting story, because you think, well, is he making up for lost time? Because he did work full time, of course, in Hong Kong, and. Or is there something within the form that he was finding so enjoyable that he just wanted to spend that much time doing it?
Yeah. Well, when Beau and I were here, when he came up to visit me, we spent like a 5-hour day, then 2 7-hour, 8-hour days. And I am a fanatic. I'm happy to talk Wing Chun and play Wing Chun as long as, even if I'm really tired. But the funny thing was, the time absolutely flew. We both went, wow. It was like, I looked at the time and went, we've been at this for 8 hours and we really hardly had a break, but it didn't seem to matter. It was like we were in a different time. And
yes,
that softness, that's what addicts me, is that soft energy, and I just want it. I want it all the time. I know what it feels like. I've felt it to quite a good extent at times, but I'd like to be at a much higher level, and that's like, for me, that's what drives me, not to go and pick fights down at the pub. I just want to find out what's possible for me to do and help other people get there too.
Yes. Well, that's sort of where I am at now. Of course, when I first started training, it was all about the fighting.
Yeah, as we were.
Which I think, if most people are honest, that's probably when they first started training. That's probably what they were either interested in or what got them interested. But you soon realise that life's too short to be fighting.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more depth to the art than fighting. So.
And it's sort of also, sorry, I was just going to say, for me, Wing Chun really soothes the savage beast. It sort of it takes away my anger, takes away my frustration at times with life or stress. It becomes very much a way of channeling energy into something much better, much more noble than just being angry and bad vibes.
Right. Yeah.
So just
I'd like to get back to Beau, but just save that question, or save that. Where am I pointing? Save that question. Just like to. I really enjoyed the conversation you had with Beau. But something I must correct or take him to task on, and that was I think he maybe took something out of context in my wooden dummy book, because I heard him. I'm sure I heard him say that he couldn't touch the dummy.
Oh, right.
Couldn't touch the dummy. I said. So I gave him a phone call later. I said, what are you talking about? Oh, no. I think I was talking in the book about how some people that come to train with me go, at their school, they weren't allowed to touch the wooden dummy, But when I was at Sifu Greg's, the dummy was quite open. It wasn't in any separate room. There was no curtains. There was no nothing. I don't know that anybody else trained on it except me when I was actually with Sifu Greg, and he gave me a few lessons on that. So and Beau knows that. When I got back to Invercargill in 1975, that was when I built my first wooden dummy and started teaching Beau because Beau had been living at our place for a while, and I started teaching Beau at that stage some of the wooden dummy movements.
So when did you actually start with Sifu Greg? Like, just tell us a little bit about it.
Not very long before that.
Yeah.
and I can possibly tell you a couple of stories about Sifu Greg, but that's quite interesting. I had a talk with, I don't know if you know Dave Richardson, but Dave's now a student of Sifu Greg's up in Brisbane. You see, Greg stopped teaching in about 1976, 77. I knew he was going to, he had told me that the story that Greg told me was that he was going to stop teaching when he got married.
Right.
Which was quite funny because I thought he was married, but I think it must have been someone else's kids were running around,
right,
running around the school. Maybe Derek Fong's. I don't know, but because Derek Fong was a training partner of I keep looking over here, so
yeah, no, you're fine. It doesn't.
Just that I'm trying to look at you, but yeah. Derek Fong, of course, was a classmate of Greg's and whatever.
So just for the viewers who don't know this history, so Sifu Greg and Derek Fong, who's a really senior student of Yip Man, who's still alive and teaches in Sydney. So they were together in Hong Kong training under Yip Man.
Yes, and well, I'll tell you a little bit about that. Sifu Greg was the first private student, what they call private student of Yip Man's in Hong Kong. So you had the early students like Chu were, and this is the way I understand it and how it was portrayed to me, was that Sifu Chu and the first, the names escape me at the moment, the first 3 or 4 of them were the closed door. They were closed door students. Sifu Greg was a private student, and then they had the public students, which were the classes which started. Sifu Greg was about 12 when he started training with Yip Man. Came from a reasonably wealthy family that I gather that could afford the fees. And Chu at that stage was about, he was about 18, 19, I think, when he started training with Yip Man, wasn't he? Choi Sung Ting?
Yes, he was a young fella. He was an accountant, I think. And
yes, he was 18, maybe 19. Greg was about 12. So Chu was about 7 or 8 years older than Greg. And when Greg would go to Yip Man's place for his lesson, if Chu was generally there. So Choi Sung Ting would, Yip Man would, I don't know, maybe have a coffee. I'll have to ad lib some of this, you know.
Yeah.
Coffee and a cigar or whatever, and say to Choi Sung Ting, could you take Choi through his form? So in that sense, Choi Sung Ting would instruct Greg, but however, Yip Man was Greg's teacher. And that's just the way we do things, really, isn't it? You know, you get a new student, you say to one of the other students here, take him through his form, you know. And so that later on, as Sifu Greg got a bit older, and he started going to the public classes, and he actually, according to Greg, he actually was one of the first, if not the first, to actually take Bruce Lee through form on his first day.
Oh, right.
So yeah, whether he was the first or whatever, but he did take him through his form anyway. That's from Sifu Greg himself.
Yeah.
The story of that I just told you about Choi Sing taking Sifu Greg through his form when Sifu Greg turned up at Yip Man's. That was relayed to me from Choi Sing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. One of my students who was in Hong Kong asked about the relationship, and that was the story I got back.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
You know, people can take that for what it's worth. So I'd already been teaching Wing Chun as I understood it up until I first went over to Sydney and trained with Greg. And so my teaching with Greg is very minimal. In fact, I had a conversation with Dave Richardson, who's now a loyal student of Sifu Greg's. When Sifu Greg retired from public teaching, his thing was to practice Chinese herbal medicine and methods, which he'd studied in Taiwan, I think. And at some stage, obviously very much later on, he's gone back to teaching, taking a private student. So he's had two that I know of in the last 10 or 15 years. One didn't work out, but Dave runs a good school up in Brisbane there. Anyway, I said to Dave and I somehow wound up in contact with each other, and I think he contacted me first and said, "Oh, I heard that you trained with Sifu Greg, you know," and I said, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, he probably wouldn't remember me." And I'll tell you a story about this.
Yeah.
Anyway, I said, "Oh, he probably wouldn't remember me," and he got back to me a while later and he said, "Oh, I asked Sifu Greg about you," and he said he did remember you and a couple of other things. So, you know, I was quite chuffed about that, you know, because, you know, I was just another face wanting to learn Wing Chun, I guess, you know.
And for a lot of people who weren't around in the 70s, it's hard for them to understand the excitement of learning Kung Fu after watching, you know, seeing the Bruce Lee movies and other things. I remember seeing the one-armed boxer and the man.
Jimmy Wang Yu.
Yeah. No, there was a few movies that came out around that same time as Bruce's movies, but they didn't compare to his. But I personally discovered Kung Fu without knowing what it was in 1967 because I was a big fan of the Green Hornet. And I really loved Kato, who of course was Bruce Lee's character. And for years, I had this memory of doing sidekicks in the primary school in the 60s. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, I think I invented Kung Fu without seeing it. You know, I remember doing it. And then one day I went, oh, wait a minute. Oh, so Bruce Lee was Kato, because I didn't know that, you know. Before video and, you know, before the internet, you could easily get mixed up about stuff. And I didn't actually realize that Kato was Bruce Lee because he sort of looked different, you know. In those younger days, he was more sort of not chubby, but more clean cut looking, I guess. And then in his Bruce Lee movie days, he always had the Bruce Lee hair and much more lean and brown.
Well, he was a bit chubby in those early days, actually. If you read some of the biographies that have been done by people who knew him at the time. But yeah, he certainly leaned out and made a muscle machine of himself.
Yeah.
My first experience of a Kung Fu movie I was already teaching people. I'd sort of fallen into teaching Dave with, I'd been a doorman. In those days, we called them a bouncer. I'd been bouncing since I was 17. And then I'd taken up boxing because, you know, I soon found out I really needed to look after myself. So I took up boxing and I really loved boxing, but Wing Chun sort of got in the way and which is a long story, but then I met I met Beau a little later. When I moved to Invercargill, I quickly wound up working as a bouncer again. I was working as a company rep, or actually I was working in a men's clothing store, and then I got a job as a company rep. But at the same time, I was moonlighting 2 or 3 nights a week as a bouncer at a big hotel in Invercargill. And I had quickly, through various stories, I'd quickly gained a bit of a reputation, and so I had a few guys coming to train with me. Can you teach us how to look after ourselves? You know, all that sort of thing. And I'd have, you know, a carload of guys turn up on a Saturday afternoon, and we'd muck around. I'd teach them what I knew of boxing, what I knew of what I learned, practical stuff that I'd learnt on the door, and what I understood at that time of Wing Chun. And it was sort of a bit of a hodgepodge mixture. And then the first Wing or the first Kung Fu movie that came to town that I remember seeing was The 5 Fingers of Death.
Yeah, right. I remember that.
With Wo Lei, I think it was. Wo Lei. Yeah. Anyway, The 5 Fingers of Death, and the next weekend I had about 10 carloads of guys turn up.
It was like that back then, wasn't it? Yeah, like I tell my kids, you know, we didn't have like a million channels. Everybody watched the same stuff at the same time, so you'd get a phenomenon would ripple through the whole community. That's what I can't believe. The craze wouldn't happen now because there's just too many different things on offer. Whereas back then it was like Kung Fu suddenly exploded. Everyone wanted to know about it.
Well, we didn't even have a TV set, Dave. So I never knew who Kato was or anything like that until long after. But yeah, it's quite interesting. So that sort of we had that many people coming around that winter. I said, because it gets really cold in Invercargill. It's a wet, damp place in winter, you know.
Yeah.
So I said, we better hire a hall. So we hired a hall, and everyone chipped in for the hall, and I said to the guys, listen, we're having a lot of fun. It's good training, but I really want to learn more about this Wing Chun. I said, I'm missing something here. So that was when I got in contact with Greg, and I said, you know, I want to come for private lessons, and he said, yeah. So I started going to Sydney, and I don't know that I learned a lot. I probably know a bit more now, but
it's amazing dedication considering how much flights cost back then, let alone private lessons.
It grew from there, you know. I used to go back to I'd stay at the People's Palace, and I'd go back with a notebook, and I'd write down everything that I'd heard that day, you know, that Sifu Greg had taught. He might have just given me one drill, and I'd work on that drill all day, you know. Which is one of the things about training you learn is when I say to you, do that 10 times, You know, you get some students who they count to 10 and then they stop, you know. No, you're meant to just keep going till I come back.
Yeah, right.
You know? In fact, I remember Sifu Greg, he said, there was a student, a student went up to the, now, a lot of people have asked me how many people were training at Sifu Greg's at the time. I think the most people I ever saw there at any one class session was about 8 or 9 of us.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd be there all day. I only went there for the private lessons, but I'd join in the class when, you know, as you do, you know.
Yep.
And one of the students, I heard him, he went over to the counter and he was saying to Sifu Greg that he wanted some, he wanted to know how to kick like Bruce Lee. And said, yes, well, what you do is you've got to have a cup of this special herb tea. And I can't remember how much it was. It was like $5 a cup or whatever. It was quite sort of expensive. So so this guy's into it. Yeah, he really wants to kick like Bruce Lee. So Greg mixes up a little cup of tea and gives it to him and says, now you drink it now. You see, you have to have 1 cup each day for a week, 1 cup every week for a month, then you have us have a cup every month. So, okay. So the guy drinks it and he says, now see that bag over there? You go and kick that bag 100 times with these legs. Soon you'll be kicking like Bruce Lee. But of course, the point of that was you weren't meant to stop at 100, you know.
Yeah, right.
Just keep kicking that bag every day forever. In fact, on that note, one of the interesting chaps that Beau and I met along the way was a chap called Norman Chin from Dunedin. And Norman started teaching about the same time I started teaching publicly, which was 1973. I think Norman started teaching publicly about 1974, and he was teaching White Crane in Dunedin.
Mm.
And Norman had trained in China, and anyway, Norman started a school in Dunedin, and Beau and I we met Norman several times. Norman stayed at my place a few times, and we went up to Norman's, and he had a fish and chip shop in Dunedin, and it was on one of the main streets, but it was backed into a hill, and up the back of the hill, I think Norman and his wife at that stage were living upstairs in the fish and chip shop. But up the back of this very steep hill, there was a little garden, sort of I'd call it a garden shed, but it was hardly a garden shed because it was collapsing on the side of the hill, you know. Right. And Norman had like a plastic football in there on a short, somehow attached to the ceiling of this little hut, and it was just probably just over my head height. Norman was a bit shorter than me, and he says, "Have a look at this," and kapow! Some sort of, you know, spinning back kick.
Wow. Yeah.
Now Norman's the only one that I have personally ever met that you never knew he was going to kick. You never telegraphed a kick. Never. Now, that's all he used to train, though. That's all he used to train every day. Was he'd spend a couple of hours, I think, warming up, because, you know, you need to kind of warm up for these things, and then a couple of hours training. He used to spend and that's what you got to do. If you want to be good at something, you've got to do it over and over again. It's about repetition. You know, ironing out those little idiosyncrasies that you've got in your physiology or the way you perform, and you've just got to work on every little bit and make it more and more perfect every day.
Yeah.
and that was Norman. They're fantastic, fantastic kicker.
It's a great story.
Yeah. Here's an interesting lesson for people, you see. Norman, when he started a school, he started basically he organised initially a committee. And it was their job to organise the place to train, collect fees, pay the, and they had a place in a church hall, I think. And Norman would just go along and teach them. And then one day I'm talking to Norman, he said, he's closed the school down. I said, why is that, Norman? He said, they gave me an ultimatum. They said, we want to learn the next form. And he said, well, you're not ready for the next form. And they said, well, we're paying you and you will teach us the next form. And he said, well, that's not how it's done. And they said, well, you're not in China now, Norman. So he just stopped teaching them.
Yeah, wow.
And they sort of cut their own throat a bit, but Norman, and of course Norman hadn't lived in China for years anyway. He was probably more Kiwi than them, but
he was just wise. Because it's like Wing Chun forms, isn't it? You jump ahead because you want to look fancy or you look like you're getting somewhere. You are cutting your own throat if you don't spend enough time mastering that previous form.
That's right. Getting back to my time with Greg, there's an interesting. How long do you need to spend with your teacher? Well, the answer, of course, is how long have you got? My teacher stopped teaching, and maybe he doesn't even regard me as a student. He just simply remembers who I was. Oh, that's an interesting story. When I was staying at the People's Palace, which was just round the corner from Greg's school at the time, and my wife was home here in Invercargill, and in the People's Palace, I think I was on about, I can't remember, the 8th floor or the 10th floor, or however many floors it had. It was just this rickety old flea-ridden hotel.
Yeah.
And the lift in it was about 150 years old, and it used to sway from side to side and bash against the walls as it was going up or down. So the hotel policy was that you weren't allowed to use the lift between something like 8 o'clock at night, or it might have been 9 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, say, whatever the time was. And this morning I'm sound asleep and I get woken up to this bang, 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 bang on my door. And I go to the door and I open it, and here's the night porter or whatever he was, the night clerk. He's just about dead. He's raced up all these flights of stairs in this old hotel to tell me that I have to go back to New Zealand quickly because my wife's gone into the hospital and she's having our babies. We had twins, boy and a girl. You need it in New Zealand. So of course I immediately thought, my wife needs me in New Zealand, and I've got to get back there. And so I went downstairs and I got onto the phone at the hotel and I rang the airport, changed my flights, and I go round to round the corner, because Greg's place was just round the corner. So I go round to the school when he opened up. I think he opened up at 9 o'clock or something. I went round there. And I said, listen, I'm sorry, Greg, I'm going back to New Zealand. He said, why? He was a bit disappointed, Favourite number one son's going back to New Zealand, Why? I said, my wife's gone into the hospital early to have the babies. Yeah, but why are you going back? I said, because they rang me up. He said, are you the doctor? Which was which is probably why he remembers me. I'm the one who scarpered back to New Zealand. But yeah, and I went back, and the twins weren't born for another, I think it was another 6 weeks. She had been taken in on an emergency. So
right.
yeah, so that was sort of that. When I don't know how we're going for time, but
Yeah,
Beau was a bit of a showman back in the day. We started a branch up in Gore, talking about numbers and fire in those days. With all the people coming around home, and we hired a hall and everything, and sort of made it official. One of the students lived up in Gore, and they said, "Oh, you know, we should start a branch in Gore." It's about an hour's drive away, and I said, "Okay, we'll go up there." So this guy organised it, and we went up there, and we had 65 people on the first night. Gore's a tiny little country and western town. You know, it's famous for country and western music. They have the annual awards there every year, you know. And yeah, we had 65 people turn up, and there was, I think, 5 or 6 in one family, one of whom was a young lady by the name of Pam, who became Beau's wife, and they've been married ever since. And sorry about that, Pam. But yeah, so
that's a great story.
And my wife's been with me. You know, I was doing boxing and bouncing and Wing Chun that before we got married. So, you know, it's been a lifetime affair. You know, so Beau was a showman, and I see he told you about how we went up. We did a number of public demonstrations. We were always getting invited to places, and Beau was like a Jackie Chan stuntman. You know, he'd organise all the fight scenes. You know,